welcome. Wherever you are, and however your day has been, this is your time now. You're invited to drift gently back through the centuries to a time of wind-swept plains, of creaking leather and wool, and of a people who reshaped the map of the world, not just with horses and arrows, but with silk, spices, and simple determination. Tonight, we turn our gaze to the Mongol Empire. When most people hear the word Mongol, their minds race toward conquest, clattering hooves, smoke on the horizon, fierce warriors with hardened faces. But history, as always, holds quieter truths, because beyond the battlefield, there were tents that needed mending, fires that needed tending, goats that needed herding. There were songs and soup and centuries of rhythm before a single border was ever redrawn. This story isn't about blood and battle cries. It's about the quieter, steadier beat of Mongol life, the long nights on the steppe, the crackle of dried dung on the fire, the rituals, the responsibilities, and the surprising reach of a people always on the move. Let your mind settle in. Let your breathing grow slower, steadier, like the gait of a camel crossing the plains. And imagine yourself not in a fortress or palace, but under the canvas of a thick felt yurt, with the cold wind brushing past outside and the warmth of stew on the fire within. We begin with life at the heart of the Mongol machine, not the army but the camp. Imagine yourself waking to the sound of canvas flapping in the wind. The sun, though low on the horizon, glows with the sharp light of a dry, open sky. The air is crisp, cutting across your cheeks as you rise from your blankets. The felt walls of your yurt, thick layers of wool, pressed tightly together, hold in just enough warmth to soften the chill, though your breath still comes out in a fine white mist. This is a Mongol camp, not just a home, but a heartbeat of the empire, nomadic, mobile, and meticulously organized. There is no stone, no timber beams, no streets, and yet it is a town of sorts, a breathing community. The yurt, called a gur by the Mongols, is more than a tent. It's a masterpiece of portability and engineering. The wooden lattice walls can be folded like a fan, the central supports taken apart and packed onto carts pulled by sturdy oxen. The thick felt covering is made from sheep's wool, pressed by hand and foot, then layered again and again until it is dense enough to keep out the wind and light enough to carry. When the tribe moves, as they often do, the gears are collapsed, tied, loaded, and reassembled again in mere hours. Each move is a practiced dance, guided by the seasons, the needs of the herd, and the wisdom of the elders. And it's not just movement for movement's sake. The grasslands, known as the steppe, are vast and ever-changing. To stay in one place too long is to risk overgrazing, to endanger the flocks and herds that sustain life. So, the Mongols move, not as wanderers, but as stewards of land that cannot be owned, only borrowed. You can almost hear it now, the bleating of goats, the soft grunts of yaks, the rhythmic clip of horse hooves as a child no older than 10 rides out to check the perimeter of the camp. Children work early. They learn the ropes, literally, how to tie a yurt frame, how to milk a mare, how to keep a fire lit with little more than dried dung and patience. The firewood is scarce, so ingenuity is constant. Breakfast might be simple: curds made from goat's milk, or a hard cheese dried in the open air. Maybe a thin porridge from millet or barley. Always a warm liquid, usually arag, fermented mare's milk, sharp and tangy, an acquired taste even among the Mongols themselves. By midday, the camp is alive with activity. The women tend to the gears, prepare meals, we've felt, and manage the family's livestock. The division of labor is clear but not unequal. Mongol women hold more autonomy than in many other cultures of the time. They can own property, tend herds, even issue commands when the men are away. You may see a woman seated beside a metal cauldron, stirring something slow and bubbling. It's goat stew thick with meat, onions, and root vegetables. Maybe a handful of wild herbs gathered from the nearby slopes. The scent is savory, earthy, touched by the faint smokiness of the fire beneath. There is little waste in Mongol cooking. Every part of the animal has a place. Meat is boiled, dried, or frozen, depending on the season. Fat is precious, especially in the bitter winters, and bones are saved for tools or broth. The animals are everything: goats, sheep, yaks, and of course, horses. The Mongol horse is small, stocky, and tireless. It thrives where other horses might falter. Each rider has several, switching from one to the next to preserve their strength. And it is said, almost poetically, that Mongols could sleep in the saddle. Whether that's quite true or not, the image alone tells you something about their bond with the animal. Around dusk, the light stretches out across the grasslands, throwing long shadows behind the gears. A quiet settles, broken only by soft conversations, the gentle laughter of children, or the distant lowing of a cow. In this moment, the empire feels far away. There are no maps, no crowns, no declarations of conquest. Here only the daily rhythm of survival, a constant negotiation with the elements, the land, and time. At night, the stars emerge, unchallenged by city lights. They blanket the sky in a soft hush, ancient and unmoving. Inside the gear, the fire burns low. You're wrapped in layers of wool and fur, lulled by the stillness, the occasional snort of a horse outside, and the knowledge that in a few hours the cycle begins again. This was the true foundation of the Mongol Empire. Not in steel, but in sheep's wool. Not in conquest, but in cooperation with each other and with the land. And so, as the fire crackles and fades, and the cold air presses in once more, let us quietly close this chapter of daily life and begin to travel backward into the distant, wind-blown childhood of the boy who would become a Khan. Let us now step further back, long before maps bore the name of his empire, before titles, banners, or armies. Imagine yourself on the vast Mongolian steppe in the mid-12th century. The wind still moves across the grass as it did in the camp before, but now it brushes over a humbler scene. A small family camp, isolated, exposed, surviving on what little they can hunt or gather. And in the middle of it all, a boy named Temujin. He was not born into greatness, though he came from a proud lineage. His father, Yasuge, was a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, man with modest power, caught in the endless flux of Mongol tribal politics. At the time, the Mongol world was not unified, but fractured hundreds of tribes and factions, each vying for grazing lands, honor, or revenge. Temujin was born into that world somewhere around the year 1162, near the Anan River. He would have opened his eyes to the inside of a gear, the warmth of his mother Echelon, and the soft rattle of the steppe winds outside. But peace would not last long. When Temujin was just 9, his father was betrayed by the Tatars, with whom he had once shared uneasy alliances. In the brutal arithmetic of steppe politics, a father's death did not always pass power to the son, especially not a son so young. And so the family was cast out. abandoned by their tribe, rejected by former allies, left to fend for themselves in the wild. Achelan, now widowed and alone with several children, became both mother and chief. She taught them how to survive on fish and wild roots, how to trap marmots, how to chew through the hardest winters with hunger in their bellies but fire in their minds. It was a hard life, a lonely one marked by deep scars, not only on the land but on the boy himself. Temujin grew up in this exile, not with the privileges of a prince, but the fears of a fugitive. He would have spent long hours watching the horizon for raiders, days gathering firewood or digging edible roots from frozen ground. Nights curled beneath fur and hide, listening to the silence stretch out beyond the walls of the yurt. Yet something grew in him. There are stories passed down and polished over generations of a boy who was cautious, observant, and quick to understand people. He watched, he remembered, and he waited. He also suffered betrayal, even from within. At one point, he and his half-brother Bekter, sons of the same father but different mothers, came to blows over food, resources, and authority. Temujin killed Bekter, a grim act, often softened in later retellings, but one that marked him forever. This was not the decision of a child raised in ease. It was a reflection of a world where survival and dominance often collided, where even blood ties could not always shield you from harsh choices. But even in this harshness, there were moments of connection. Temujin formed his first important bond with another boy, Jamuka. The two swore loyalty as Anda blood brothers. Together, they would hunt, ride, and dream of futures far beyond their family fires. But history is rarely kind to such friendships, and theirs, too, would twist into rivalry, and later into war. As Temujin entered his teenage years, he began to build a small following not through fear or inheritance, but through loyalty. He gathered the outcast, the overlooked, those tired of the endless feuds between noble lineages. He promised them something different, not a world of revenge, but of reward for merit. The Mongol world was built on status. Temujin began to chip away at that. He was captured once by a rival triband, placed in a wooden yoke, a heavy, humiliating frame meant to break the spirit. But Temujin did not break. He escaped, aided by a sympathetic guard who, perhaps, saw something in the boy's eyes, a calm, unsettling conviction. As the years passed, he married Bert, a woman from a neighboring tribe. Their union was not just romantic, but strategic, and when Bert was later kidnapped by raiders, Temujin's mission to rescue her would serve as the first rallying cry for what would become his army. This moment, small on the surface, was the hinge upon which everything turned. He gathered allies, he fought back, he succeeded, not with overwhelming force, but with clarity, strategy, and above all, resilience. And so Temujin, this boy of the steppe, orphaned, betrayed, imprisoned, began to draw others to him, not just with his skill, but with his vision. He was offering something rare: unity, order, a future beyond the endless tribal wars. He would become Genghis Khan, but that name, that legend, that comes later. For now, picture him not on a throne, but sitting by a low fire, sharpening tools, murmuring softly to his horse. A man still shaped by hunger and wind. A man still looking toward the horizon. And as we leave him there, in the glow of flickering flame, let us now turn to something perhaps unexpected. The world he would one day build, not with swords, but with roads. Let's travel now to the great Silk Road, the quiet genius of how the Mongols made it safe. As the campfires of Temujin's youth faded into history, and the name Genghis Khan echoed across the plains, the Mongol Empire stretched outward, not only through conquest, but through connection. The Silk Road, ancient and winding, had existed long before the Mongols. It was not a single road, but a sprawling web of paths, like threads on a loom, weaving together China, Central Asia, Persia, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe. Along it flowed not just silk, but spices, porcelain, paper, silver, and sometimes ideas. Before Mongol rule, these routes were dangerous. Bandits haunted mountain passes, border wars disrupted trade, kingdoms taxed merchants cruelly at every crossing, and information so precious and so fragile often arrived too late, if it arrived at all. But the Mongols saw this differently. For them, the world was not a patchwork of isolated kingdoms, it was one vast territory to be bridged. And so, they did something unusual for conquerors of their time. They protected the roads. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol Empire enforced a kind of strict, overarching peace, what later historians would call the Pax Mongolica. Imagine a merchant caravan, loaded with bolts of Chinese silk, setting out from the old city of Chang'an. It creaks and shifts as it crosses grasslands and deserts. But for once, the greatest danger is not robbery or war. That caravan under Mongol law was protected, not only in theory, but in practice. Along the routes stood postal stations, relay posts, and armed patrols. This was the Yam system, established by Genghis Khan and refined by his descendants. The Yam was a vast communication and transportation network. Every 25 to 30 miles, there stood a way station where couriers and travelers could rest, swap horses, eat, and sleep. These were not dusty sheds, but sometimes well-provisioned outposts run with discipline and accuracy. Mongol messengers, often wearing leather pouches and armed with a tablet of authority called a peza, could ride up to 200 miles in a single day by changing horses at each post. To steal from a Yam courier or interfere with the mail was to invite the swift justice of Mongol law. And so, the Silk Road transformed. Imagine yourself as a Venetian merchant arriving in Central Asia with glassware and dyes, or perhaps as a Persian scholar carrying manuscripts and medicine. Under Mongol rule, you were no longer merely tolerated, you were welcomed. Passports were issued, translators and guides were assigned. Roads, once broken and overgrown, were now smoothed by hoof and wheel. This was not a kindness, it was strategic brilliance. The Mongols, though feared for their warfare, were equally focused on administration. Trade meant taxes, and taxes meant stability. Information moved faster, and in a time before wires and wireless signals, the Yam system was their internet. Paper money, introduced under the Yuan dynasty, flowed through the arteries of this network. So did art, inventions, and sometimes even entire species grapevines from Europe, oranges from Persia, even musical instruments traveled with traders. Along the route, cities flourished. Places like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar became hives of activity, cosmopolitan centers where Mongol officials lived side by side with Chinese artisans, Arab astronomers, Armenian traders, and Sogdian scribes. It was, in its quiet way, one of the most multicultural environments the world had ever seen. Even the culinary world was transformed. Persian saffron found its way into Chinese recipes. Noodles traveled westward and returned, changed. Techniques for brewing distilling, and preserving foods were shared across cultures. But perhaps most curious of all was the Mongol reverence for knowledge. Though they burned cities in war, they also patronized scholars. They invited doctors, engineers, astrologers, and architects from every corner of the known world to their courts. And so, the roads carried more than goods. They carried language, medicine, stories, religions. Yet not all was peace. The very system that carried silk also carried disease. The bubonic plague, which would later devastate Europe, may have traveled along these same roads, hidden in flea-ridden bundles or infected travelers. But the Mongols themselves did not flinch from such risks. They valued speed, consistency, and clarity. And in many ways, they created the first truly global infrastructure. Even centuries later, travelers like Marco Polo would marvel at how well maintained the roads were, how secure they felt, and how diverse the cultures seemed under one distant banner. So the next time you think of the Mongols, think not only of the battlefield, but of the caravan, of tired mules with woven blankets, of post stations lit by flickering lamps, of documents sealed with wax, speeding across the wilderness, of a world that, for a rare moment in history, felt both vast and surprisingly connected. And now, let us step out of the dust of the road. Let us draw closer to the very center of power, a place where silence could be dangerous, and every glance could mean life or death. Let us visit the court of the Khan. Now, let the dust of the road settle behind you. Leave the wide steppes, the clinking of caravan bells, and the bustle of roadside stations behind, and drift instead toward the imperial center, into the hush of silken canopies, the steady beat of ceremonial drums, and the complex, choreographed rhythms of courtly life. Welcome to the heart of the Mongol Empire. Not a palace of gold and jewels, like you might find in Persia or Byzantium, but a mobile Korda, moving capital, vast and orderly, unfolding wherever the Khan chose to settle. At its center was the Orju, the royal encampment, and within that, the great yurt-domed, felt-covered tent that housed the Khan and his retinue. Imagine it now, a circular space, larger than most city homes, lit by filtered daylight, its floors covered in woven rugs from distant lands. The air is heavy with the scent of fermented mares, milk, sandalwood, and ink. There are no walls lined with paintings, but there are scrolls, maps, documents. Knowledge is prized here. The court is quiet, but never idle. Officials come and go. Messengers arrive on horseback. Foreign emissaries wait in carefully measured silence. This courtin, like many in the medieval world, is a gathering of the globe. The Mongols, master strategists, brought not only armies under their command, but also people, ideas, and talents. If a civilization had something to offer, the Khan wanted to hear from them. Diplomats arrived from all directions. There were Arab scholars from Baghdad, Christian envoys from the Pope, Buddhist monks from Tibet, and Confucian scribes from China. Some brought gifts, cloth dyed with rare colors, mechanical clocks, falcons trained to hunt. Others came with proposals, maps, even marriage alliances. Each guest was expected to know the customs. In the Mongol court, etiquette was not a formality, was a matter of survival. One did not step on the threshold of a yurt. One bowed low, but did not avert the eyes too soon. One accepted gifts with both hands. One waited patiently, sometimes for days, to be summoned. One spoke only when spoken to and never raised their voice. To violate these rules was not merely rude, it could be fatal. There are quiet stories of diplomats who spoke out of turn and never returned home, of nobles who misinterpreted a gesture and were quickly removed. The court was a place of knowledge, yes, but also of razor-thin tension, where every movement held meaning. But it was also a place of astonishing sophistication. Translators called Elchi moved swiftly between tongues: Arabic, Persian, Uyghur, Chinese, Latin. They were scholars, often learned men taken from cities like Bukhara or Samarkand, trained to interpret not only words, but intentions. Documents flowed in and out written on paper, silk, or sometimes bark. There were official letters sent with Peza medallions tablets that served as passports, stamped with the Khan seal. One such letter, sent to the Pope, invited peace and religious dialogue. Though the Mongols were not known for cartography in the modern sense, their curiosity was boundless. They gathered information from travelers, spies, merchants. Their sense of geography was both fluid and sharp. Rivers, mountain passes, oases, townsel, stored in the minds of generals and ministers. Some suggest the Khan's court had the most accurate sense of the world's layout of any power at the time. Inside the court, administrators managed a complex bureaucracy. There were census records, tax rolls, trade logs. Cities that submitted peacefully were often taxed lightly and given Mongol protection. Cities that resisted were noted, and sometimes returned to, with far greater force. The court functioned like a brain-absorbing knowledge, issuing orders, processing the movements of an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary. And curiously, for all their fierceness, the Mongols allowed a surprising amount of local autonomy. They did not force their language or religion. Instead, they allowed Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others to worship Frelias, long as they paid tribute and respected the authority of the Khan. In fact, at one point, a Nestorian Christian woman held enormous influence at the court of Kublai Khan, and Islamic astronomers were invited to refine the Mongol calendar. The court was a paradox, brutal, yet open, orderly, yet unpredictable. In such a place, even entertainment served a purpose. There were musicians from Persia, storytellers from the Caucasus, jugglers from the steppes. These performances were not mere leisure, they were part of diplomacy, a way of offering respect and showing value. The Khan himself might sit on a raised platform, his face unreadable. Around him, his wives, generals, and ministers would observe quietly, taking mental notes of every gesture. Even laughter, here, was measured. And the court would settle into evening rhythms discussions, strategy and ceremony continuing under stars that looked down on the largest empire the world had ever known. And now, as the campfire burns low and the tents begin to quiet, we prepare to leave the court behind. Let us gently return to the present, still carrying echoes of hoofbeats, scrolls, and the soft rustle of silk in the wind. As we leave behind the shifting steppes and the murmuring winds of the past, let us take one final, slow breath in the presence of the Mongol Empire. History often remembers the Mongols only by their conquests, the galloping charge, the sieges, the smoke of fallen cities. But now you know life in the Mongol world was much more than that. There were quiet mornings in felt-covered yurts, the scent of goat stew simmering over coals, the careful weaving of a mat, the cradling of a child, herding and crafting, building and tending to animals and kin. And there were boys like Temujin, before he became Genghis Khan, boys who knew hunger, betrayal, and cold, who grew not by magic but by persistence, endurance, and a certain unbreakable vision. His rise was not a tale of glory, but of survival, of binding the loyalty of others, not through fear alone, but through promise and reliability. Efficient planning of Mongol governors and commanders who knew that to move goods, people, and messages across continents, you must provide water, protection, and trust. Their empire, vast as it was, became a network where languages mixed and fortunes were made, where silence spoke louder than words, where one misstep could cost you, and yet where ideas from across the known world were gathered like precious stones, a place of control and curiosity, of diplomacy woven into every motion, every word, every glance. Perhaps you noticed how their world moved in circles, the round yurt, the circular arrangement of the camp, the endless horizon of the steppe, a rhythm to it all, predictable, steady, like breath, like the beat of a horse's hooves across open land. As your body begins to still and the mind softens into that quiet space between waking and sleep, imagine yourself under that same night sky, the same stars the Mongols saw spread above the steppe. You hear the low hum of a faraway flute. You smell the last smoke of the fire curling toward the stars, and you feel the cool, endless hush of history, safe, distant, and now quiet once more. Rest easy, traveler of time. Tomorrow will come soon enough. But for now, sleep.